Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Ichon, Senior Vice President, and with me is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications.
Hi, Ro. How are you?
Well, I'm okay, Tim, but I don't know how the country is. It wasn't long ago when the Biden administration was celebrating this PR victory with the passage of the infrastructure bill in the Senate. Now there's been this total reversal of fortune, and the debacle is still, unfolding in Afghanistan. And against this backdrop of we have growing cases of the Delta variant in the state, putting a damper on economic activity. We have chaos at the southern border as more migrants continue to cross, images of shootings every night on TV in our major cities, inflation worries. With all these national issues, I got to believe that Californians, even with so many progressives in the state, are starting to be uneasy about where the country is going.
Well, it definitely feels like a house of cards is tumbling down. And if there's one person who is probably feeling uneasy these days, it's our governor, Gavin Newsom. His strategy, he has said it many times, they believe if Democrats vote in the recall, they will win. And he has been pushing hard for the president and the vice president to come to California and campaign for him in person in the closing weeks of the campaign. And he said they're negotiating on trying to work something out with their schedules. But you have to wonder, after the last week, is that going to be the big boost that they once thought it was? Is surrounding yourself with an increasingly unpopular president and vice president, is that really going to turn folks out and help you get across the finish line? And I don't know. You also wonder, are Democrats a bit dispirited these days? How does your run-of-the-mill Democratic voter, look at Biden? Are they going to be excited after what's happened of the past week? Is that going to fire them up to go out and vote for Gavin Newsom? And I don't know the answer to that question.
I like your blog that you did. You talk about the Ides of September.
Well, I've wondered all along. We saw during COVID, Gavin Newsom had a press conference every day. He didn't hesitate to sign executive orders and take action and, use the power of his office and the power of government. But you've seen as the recall became a reality, he's much more muted. Dare I say he's aloof. He's doing cleanups of kind of trash-filled areas under freeways and near homeless encampments. And when we've had these debates over, local coronavirus restrictions increasing after they were lifted on a statewide level, he's kind of played second fiddle. And he said, that's the locals. That's not me. Let them, I believe in local control. So, whereas Gavin Newsom in the height of his power, he wouldn't have hesitated to order new statewide restrictions with the Delta variant rising and hospital emergency rooms increasingly running out of beds. So it kind of makes you wonder, should we beware the Ides of September? If Gavin Newsom survives the recall, and the most polls show that he's narrowly ahead, what Gavin Newsom can we expect to see? And so I kind of play a what-if game and on things like additional restrictions or even a future lockdown. What about single payer? He is a single payer proponent, but he's kind of punted it to the side. Well, the nurses union is a strong supporter of his in this campaign. Once we're through the recall, might he decide to repay his supporters and become a more enthusiastic supporter of single payer? And then the whole school lockdown issue. We're having these requirements that, everybody basically has to get vaccinated at a school. Might he take an increasingly tough stance on that after the election? Might we see more school closures or a return to kind of a hybrid in-person and at-home learning? So I think there's a lot of what if that we could go through, but I think it will be very interesting to see what Gavin Newsom emerges on September 15th if he does indeed beat the recall.
Well, our podcast guest this week, Tim, is Pat Nolan. He's a director of the American Conservative Union Foundation Center for Criminal Justice Reform, and he wrote this terrific chapter for a new book, Saving California, where he talks about really really California's crime problem, and gives it and he gives a great perspective on why we have rising crime and what we can do to try to take us back to the days when California was known for being tough on crime.
And he has a very interesting story that he shares at the beginning of our podcast. He's a former assembly member, and he, fell victim to an anti-corruption push at the state capitol in the late 1980s, where I think most people would argue he was kind of hosed in what went down. And from that experience and having to go to prison, he's doing so much good and became such an interesting and compelling leader on these issues. So I think our listeners will enjoy hearing his story and his very real world perspective on the issue.
That's right. He spent, I believe, about a couple of years in prison. And so he had firsthand knowledge of what it takes to try and reform prisoners. California has a recidivism rate of about 50%, and he's got ideas on how we can do better on that. So thank you all for listening. Welcome to PRI's Next Round podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
We are delighted to have you join us to talk about your chapter in PRI's new book, Saving California, which focuses on something we're all worried about, frankly, rising crime. Before we have our conversation, you've got a very interesting life story, how you became one of our nation's most prominent proponents of right on crime and public policy safety issues. Could you share with our listeners your journey that led you to advocating for criminal justice reform?
Yes, I have led an interesting life. I grew up on Crenshaw Boulevard, which was an area in pretty steep decline. Crime was an everyday factor there. Every member of my family was a victim of the crime. A neighbor was murdered coming out of Mass, 6:30 Mass in the morning. The Bank of America at the corner was robbed. My brother was a delivery boy for the pharmacy at the corner, and he returned from one of his deliveries to find the owners, Mr. and Mrs. Wright, bound and gagged. They'd been hit for the narcotics. So crime was something. And as a paper boy, I was robbed frequently during election time. So when I got elected to the legislature, I really wanted to do something about it. I saw the damage to families, to neighborhood institutions, and so at that time, my feeling was, well, the answer is, tougher on crime, longer sentences, build more prisons. And it wasn't until I myself was a prisoner as a result of a very politically based FBI operation. But, I was facing mandatory minimum sentences, the alleged 6 felony counts, and my children were young. The daughter's 5 and 4, and our son was just 10 months old. And I thought we could win, but, their lives hung in the balance. If I lost, I would have been away for 21 years. So I swallowed my pride and pleaded guilty. And that began an adventure every step of the way. My wife and I said there's a purpose that God has allowed this to happen. And I tell people I went into prison believing in God, but I came out knowing Him. I saw Him so active around me. Prisons are a dark place. The devil owns the corridors. The only light is from the religious services led by volunteers who come in. And so that changed me. And I also saw the injustice of the systems. Yeah, most of the people I was in with had committed crimes, but a lot of them, they didn't keep you up at night worrying that they'd do something to you. A lot of them ran for drugs and minor crimes to support their drug habit. Anyway, while I was in prison, out of the blue, I was 2 weeks from release, and I got a phone call, and generally the prisons don't take phone calls for you, but they did, and said somebody from Prison Fellowship had called and was wondering, Chuck Colson wanted me to become president of Justice Fellowship, which was part of his ministry, part that works on criminal justice reform. And, lo and behold, God's plan, was all of a sudden it became clear why he'd allowed this to be done to me and my family, because this job with Chuck advocating for reforms in the criminal justice system knit together my experience as a lawyer, my leadership in the legislature, but also my 29 plus months in federal custody. That really equipped me uniquely to talk to legislators, frankly, and especially conservative legislators, many of whom I know, and say, you need to wake up. Nothing's being done to prepare these folks for release. We're locking up a lot of people we're mad at. We should instead just lock up those we're afraid of. And we began to build a successful conservative movement for reform, which Right on Crime became an expression of. And it culminated with President Trump signing the bipartisan bill, the First Step Act, in poisonous Congress. It's the only really bipartisan bill to pass of substance, and that's how God worked. Mother Teresa said, "I'm just a pencil in God's hand, writing a love letter to the world, and I'm the instrument, but it's God who took all those experiences, knit them together, and prepared me to help spread the good news of the Bible and also apply those biblical principles to criminal justice."
So when public safety officials are asked about crime in California, we see these days their press conferences or when they answer reporters, they're quick to point out many positive statistics. But, we're all seeing images these days, the famous example in San Francisco of thieves literally walking out of stores with armfuls of merchandise, and no one is stopping them. And anecdotally, I think we all feel less safe in our homes and communities these days. So maybe you could paint the picture for us as we get into this discussion of crime and criminal justice policy in California. Just how dangerous are things in California these days?
They're very dangerous. The elected law enforcement folks can try to put lipstick on the pig, but the reality is crime is, especially violent crime, is going through the roof. Just as an example, just in this last year, homicides increased 27% statewide. That's the largest increase in over 30 years. In Alameda County, violent crime homicides went up 57%. In Fresno, 44%. In Sacramento, 36%. In LA, 32%. And it's continuing to go up. And, the old saying, there are lies, damned lies, and statistics. The chiefs who, remember, most police chiefs, all police chiefs, and are appointed by the city councils of their city. So they're political appointees. And so they're going to mouth whatever their bosses on the city council want them to say. But so they take things and say, well, crime overall is down. Well, yes, in some crimes, the nonviolent crimes are down. What kind of idiot burglar would burglarize a home when we're all locked down and in the house? Burglaries usually takes place when people are away from their home. Well, with the lockdown, we've been home. So, of course, those are down. So they cherry pick the statistics and they load a lot of things into the crime. But what the public's concerned is violent crime. And there's no way of hiding the fact that violent crime is way up in the state of California. And sadly, it's the poor that, the liberals claim that they're helping with these policies. They're the ones that suffer. A lot of people in our circumstances are picking up and leaving California. The poor can't afford to. Blacks and browns. I just read that Hispanic males have the highest murder rate. They are victims of murder more than any other racial group. That's astounding. They're subject to, these gangs. And here we elect a DA in LA County, Gascon, who literally the day he was sworn in, he disbanded their gang unit. these trained professionals that knew how to monitor and try to go after the bad leaders of the gangs. He disbanded them. It's insanity. Anyway, so yes, I've been a long answer to your question. California is very dangerous, and people have every right to express their concern about their own safety and the safety of their loved ones and neighbors.
We've had a rapid shift in public safety policy in California over the past decade. Accelerating this shift is the election of woke prosecutors like Chesa Boudin in San Francisco and George Cascon, as you mentioned, in Los Angeles. How is the election of prosecutors who function these days more like public defenders are contributing to California's growing crime problem?
Boy, they're a big part of it. I really worked hard to sort of be a Paul Revere because George Soros has, over the last decade, poured millions in to elect these woke DAs. And in fact, one of these woke DAs in Philadelphia, Larry Krasner, who was just awful, bragged. He said, I'm like a public defender now with muscle. That's not his job as the DA. His only legal experience prior to that was filing 75 lawsuits against the Philadelphia Police Department. Anyway, in California with Chesa Boudin, who, is a communist, he literally paid his own way down to be an advisor to Chavez in South America. His parents were part of the Weather Underground and part of a robbery that ended up with two law enforcement people murdered. He was then raised, because his parents were in prison, by Bill Ayers and his wife Bernadine Dorn, who were also part of the Weather Underground and bombers and celebrated the bombing and the killing of Americans. This is the man that's now DA in San Francisco, and it's only because Soros and his Silicon Valley folks, who all lived, behind gates and their own private patrols, they foisted them on the city. In L.A., they imported Gascon, who was the DA of San Francisco, brought him down to L.A., and he's wreaked havoc among local law enforcement. And the result has been, he's reluctant to file charges against anybody, with one exception. If they're a law enforcement officer, he goes after them hammer and tongue. It just, you got to shake your head. To understand these folks, they are not interested in safer communities. They're not interested in enforcing the law. Their object is to destroy the criminal justice institutions. They want it to collapse from the stress that they're putting on it. And there were two socialists, literally members of the Democratic Socialist Party at Columbia University, Cloward and Piven, who came up with a theory that if we're going to have revolution here, we have to stress all of our institutions to the point where they collapse. And from that chaos will come the revolution. And that's what Chesa Boudin and George Gascon are. They're trying to destroy our criminal justice system. By the way, they've taken an oath just to enforce the law. Who are they to say, well, these are laws are on the books, but we're just not going to enforce them? That's the legislature's job to decide what's a crime. Their job is to enforce them. No, they declared whole categories was, well, we're just not going to enforce them. Anyway, it's disastrous for the people of California.
So let's turn to some of your recommended reforms to make Californians safer. First, you distinguish between what I think we'd all consider to be responsible criminal justice reforms with efforts by some progressive activists to abolish prisons or wipe strong public safety protections off the books. So how, in your view, do we strike a balance between protecting society from violent offenders, but yet enacting, reforms that I think we'd all agree with, to our sentencing laws?
Yeah, that has become a big problem. I've been involved in organizing conservatives to support criminal justice reforms for 25 years now. In the last year and a half, it's become much tougher because of these woke social justice warriors whose agenda is not safer communities, it's chaos. And unfortunately, they get the headlines. And so when we propose our reasonable reforms, there's a lot of pushback from conservatives saying, oh, this is just part of that crazy left-wing, undercut the police movement. And we have to do a lot of repair work to say, hey, that's not real reform. That's revolution, But we're, there's no doubt our criminal justice system is failing us, and we need to reform it, but not destroy it. And that's where we really part company with the left. Years ago, I was at a conference, and the majority of the people there were for abolishing prison. And when I said, hey, folks, there are people that are so dangerous, we need to segregate them for society. Some of them for the rest of their life. I got booed and heckled for that. As Andy Sipowicz on NYPD Blue would say, you just can't make this stuff up. And now we have AOC and the Squad advocating abolishing prisons. But what kind of fairyland do they live in? I do think America locks up too many people for, low-level crimes. I do think we've criminalized so many things that aren't inherently evil. They're just bad because the government has passed a law saying we shouldn't do them. And those folks are not the ones we lie awake at night fearful that are going to harm us. One of the rubrics we use is the prisons are for people we're afraid of, but we're filling them with folks we're just mad at. A substantial number of the prisoners, are not a physical threat to us. What they do is bad, shoplifting, burglarizing. That's fine. They need to be punished, but that's not the same as somebody who, puts a gun in your face and robs you, or as we see is happening on the streets of New York, assassinating people on the streets just out of the blue, so we have to work with the conservatives and say, look, our reforms are reasonable and they'll improve the system, not what these folks are doing, which destroys the system. And frankly, we're getting traction because most legislators realize that our system is broken. It's not giving the appropriate sentences of the seriousness of the crime. And so we need to adjust those so that it reflects the real harm that's done by the crime. And another rubric we have is no punishment should do more harm to the offender and the community than the underlying crime did itself. You have some of these folks doing 20 and 30 years with no violence involved at all. Yeah, they're doing something bad. I don't want them dealing in drugs, but that's not the same as a murderer, a rapist. So we need to make those distinctions. And when we have the time and the ear of legislators, and we have the credibility. I'm working with the American Conservative Union now, and we've been very forceful in supporting these legitimate, reasonable reforms. And at CPACs, it's a very popular topic. The support of the membership is really behind us. And we just, ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, just had a meeting in Salt Lake City. We had a panel of several prosecutors saying that we needed to have reform. Again, not like Buden and Gascon are doing, but we do need reform. Prison space is expensive. It should block up the folks that are really dangerous. So, and that got a great reception from ALEC members, which are legislators from all 50 states. But the woke prosecutors have made my job much tougher.
Pat, you touched on this a bit. Those who are addicted or mentally ill occupy too much space in our prison system today. What do you recommend that state officials do to transform our outdated thinking to ensure that they receive proper care and treatment while still ensuring that justice is served for victims of crime?
Yeah, there's so many people in prison for, dealing small amounts of crime. Sometimes the police will structure a drug buy. They get somebody that's selling drugs and they just sell them in the community. But the police, undercover police officer will ask them to meet them across, at a house, which happens to be across the street from the school, or, a house or a parking lot nearby a church. Well, the laws are such that drugs sold within so many feet of a school or a church the penalties are much, much higher. Now, the drug seller wasn't intending. He probably didn't even notice it was near a school or a church. He was interested in a sale. So what the police in that case are doing is creating a much bigger crime with more penalty than what was really the transaction that was going down. And that's sort of artificially pumping the books, and it fills our prisons with these low-level drug dealers. I don't want them dealing drugs, and I certainly don't want them dealing near school. But, they weren't there because they wanted to sell near school. They weren't selling to school children or children in a daycare center at a church. They were though selling it to a police undercover officer who asked them to meet them there. So we need to look at the sentences and say, what's the harm that's done to the community? In that case, there's no identifiable victim. Yes, it's harmful to the community. I don't want that poison sold on our streets. But, there's no way to identify a particular victim. On the other hand, an offender who does that long sentence because the police lured him to that place, his family pays the price. Usually they go on welfare. All the statistics are that the children of the incarcerated have much more difficult time in school because they're lacking a parent, or maybe both, and so it's not good for society. So we need to measure the whole cost of society of locking something like that up for years. And it's, of course, much harder to get a job after that. So for the drug offenders, another thing, less than 20% of offenders in prison receive any treatment. Now, that's just a fraud on the public. Here we have literally a captive audience, and yet they aren't provided the treatment. And to show how public officials manipulate things, I was for the House Judiciary Committee subcommittee on crime and justice, and I testified about the need for reforms. Following me was the then head of the Bureau of Prisons, and one of the members had asked a question I planned to do with him to say, how many of the inmates that are drug addicts receive treatment? And he looked at the congressman and said, "Congressman, I assure you, there is drug treatment available in every one of our institutions." Now, that was an obfuscation, because yes, it's available, but in the federal system, it's only 10%. There aren't enough seats in the classes. They don't have enough classes. So here they lock the person up. They do nothing about the underlying drug habit and then release them in the public. That makes no sense whatsoever. That's not helping public safety. That's harming public safety. So for the drug dealers, there's that. On the mental health, I'm really passionate about this. The people with mental illness are not bad. They don't have a malignant heart. They have a chemical imbalance that makes them unstable, schizophrenic or manic depressive, and they're not criminals. And it's cruel to put them into jail or prison because the other inmates pick on them. The guards they're a pain in the neck too, because by definition, somebody that's mentally ill can't follow orders. But jails and prisons run on orders. At a certain time, you're out of your cell and you go to the cafeteria. Another time you move to your work assignment, and people that are living in another world because of their mental illness aren't cooperative. So the guards get mad at them. They throw them in solitary, which exacerbates their mental illness. The other inmates pick on them, and when they lash out, then they're in for a strike for swinging at another prisoner or pushing back when they've been teased. That gets them in trouble. It's much better and much cheaper to treat them in civilian hospitals where they can get stabilized on their medication, given 3 squares a day because a lot of them aren't eating properly, get them stabilized, and they can live healthy, productive lives. And there's a new concept called offender outcare treatment where they remain at the jurisdiction of the court. So if they go off their meds and start acting out again, they can be brought back, re-institutionalized, not in a prison, but in a mental health facility, stabilized again and gotten back on their feet. That'll save the public a ton of money, and it'll make our jails and prisons easier to operate. And I'll tell you, the people that really appreciate it are the cops on the street, because they're having to take in these dangerous people. Most officer-involved injuries come from mental illness and domestic disputes, and they're fearful going to a mental illness call. Anyway, so I think the 2 things: get drug offenders treatment and get the mentally ill into civilian facilities where their needs can be met and the public kept safer than throwing them in prison.
So since Governor Brown's prison realignment law was enacted about a decade ago now, the role that parole officers play in the shift of offenders, many of whom have committed serious and repeat crimes, from prison to local communities has really been underreported. So how would you reform California's parole system to maximize public safety? And what steps should government take to ensure that now too frequent parole violations have some consequences?
That is a huge problem. First, you need to realize that Governor Brown did that not because it was an efficient way to handle criminals, not because it would make communities safer, but he was under a federal court order to reduce the population of state prisons because they were overcrowded, which leads to violence. There's no room to have beneficial programs for inmates because every square inch is used for dormitories. And so he had to get underneath the cap put on by the federal judges, so he just shipped them out to the county jails with no preparation, and with the county parole officers totally overwhelmed them. So first of all, that was a terrible mistake to do that. But now that it's been done, California has a stupid law that says every person that leaves custody has to have a parole officer. Well, some folks are not at risk. They learn their lesson. They're going to do fine. The people we really worry about are the violent folks. But our parole officers are so busy chasing after low-level people that they don't have time for the serious. And a judge in Hawaii, who's now the DA in Honolulu, Steve Ong, was surprised. He'd have the probation officers come in, and one of these guys had 37 violations. And so the probation officer was in asking for him to be sent back to prison for the years that were left on his sentence. And Judge Ong said, well, that doesn't make any sense to me. How is it that we let him have 37 violations before you came to me? And he began thinking about it, if my kids are acting out and I let them get away with it, get away with it, and then I get angry and swat them on the bottom, that's not good for them. Instead, I need to correct them each time. And if they don't listen, then gradually increase the consequence. So he came up with a program called Hope, Hawaii Hope, and it's been phenomenal in its success. The first violation, they're brought into it. And, first of all, when they're put on probation, they're told, look, we take our rules serious. You don't have to like them, but you do have to obey them. And if you violate them, you're going to be right back here in front of me. And sure enough, the first violation, the act before him, he said, hey, you're not following the rules. But he doesn't send her back to prison for years. He says, now, I'm putting you in jail, and you're going to sit there for 48 hours. And you get a chance to think about how knuckleheaded you are and think about why you're not following the rules. And so they come out, and he says, all right, now, you've had your first shot. Now you go out and keep your nose clean. When they come in the second time, he says, I'm losing patience with you. Now you're going to sit there for a week. And, that's not good for you. It's not good for your family, but it's the rules, and we're going to live by them. And if they do it again, then they do go back for the years. So what he's done is dramatically reduce the number of people sent back to prison.
Pat, much of your life has been devoted to advocating for faith-based programs for inmates. You write that California inmates may have access to Bible studies, for example, but not faith-based rehabilitation programs. In your view, how can expanded faith-based programs in our prisons help turn around the lives of inmates and prepare them to become good citizens when they complete their sentences?
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, to change someone, you must love them, and they must know that you love them. Government programs aren't able to love inmates. We don't expect them to. That's not their job. It takes people to love inmates and to change them, to hold them accountable, give them a helping hand, but make sure they're keeping their nose clean. It's individuals from the community coming in, establishing a rapport with the inmates while they're still incarcerated, then meeting them at the gate, having prepared their church to accept them, because one of the things prisoners fear most is they usually have tattoos and missing teeth. They'll be rejected when they go to church. And so the mentor, tells the congregation, the pastor, and they welcome them to the church. They're glad to have them there. So they have a home. And one of the things the church is good for is, if they haven't been able to find a job yet, they can volunteer at the church. And churches are full of, healthy, vibrant people. John DiIulio, the great sociologist, said, the last two institutions to leave the inner city are liquor stores and the church. Wow, that was powerful, he said, because it's absolutely true. And liquor stores, I'm not against alcohol, but liquor stores are clusters of vice, gambling, prostitution, drugs, fights. Churches are clusters of vibrant, healthy, good activity. And so we want them in the environment of the church, not hanging around the liquor store. But also the mentor can help them. You've been locked up. A lot of the guys coming out that have been locked up for years walk into a bathroom and they can't figure out how to wash their hands. They don't know there's a little sensor they put their hands in front of to make the faucet work. They're looking around, why doesn't any water come out? They don't know how to use an ATM. When in the prison, you had to go into the bank to withdraw any money. Now they can go to an ATM. How do they get their driver's license? I get frustrated at the DMV. Think of someone who's been locked up for years that gets jerked around by the bureaucracy. You wait an hour in line, you get up to the window, and they say, I'm closing for lunch. Go get in that line. You want to help the returning offender avoid those tension-filled situations, but also to hold them accountable. If they miss a meeting with their probation officer, the mentor goes out and says, what's going on? Why are you messing up here? I put myself on the line for you, and you're letting me down. And also, what we found is with the mentors, the probation officers trust our mentors because they've been trained, and so they'll ask, is this guy making it or not? Our mentors are honest. No, he just can't seem to stay on the straight and narrow, or hey, he's really trying. I know he's stumbled a couple of times, but it's worth giving him some time to get his feet under him. And that results in better decisions on who to send back and who to give a little longer time to try to clean up their life. So the church is essential in that. And the one thing the gospel does is give people hope. One of the things we said at Prison Fellowship is the ground is level at the foot of the cross. We're all sinners saved by grace. So, none of us are better than you. Now, you've acted out more or whatever, and we'd like to help you. You break those habits, but, we're all sinners. So we're not looking down on you. We're reaching out as brothers saying, you're a child of God, made in his image, and we want to help you live up to that. Anyway, faith is just essential. Study after study has shown how effective faith is in transforming people.
So our Saving California book comes out with a recall vote just around the corner, and with polls showing that it's a much closer race than most of us could have imagined. So what would be your top 3 recommendations that you would give to either Governor Newsom if he wins, or if one of his challengers wins on September 14th, that you would say these are the top 3 things should be his top 3 priorities on public safety policy when either staying in office or taking office?
The first thing is move the mentally ill out of prisons and jails. That'll free up a lot of beds, and they'll be treated better. It's more humane. It's less costly to the state to have them in civilian mental hospitals and supervised. So that's number one. And again, the police will love that because they don't like locking up people that are ill rather than bad. The second thing I'd say is change the law so that not everybody has to be followed by a probation officer, but those that are the greatest risk to the community are put on a very short leash, and the parole officers have a low enough caseload that they can stay on top of those folks. Not just sit in the office, have them come in, go out and visit their home. You can tell a bunch by a site visit. You can talk to the neighbors, say, hey, how are they doing? You can see, is the front yard neatly kept, or is it a mess? You go into the house because the probation officer allowed that. You can see if the kids are hungry and unfed, or they're well cared for. You can see if there are dishes in the sink and rotting garbage, or a neatly kept house. So you can tell a lot from that. You may go out and talk to their employer and say, how are they doing? So give the probation officers a low enough caseload so they can do those proactive things rather than sitting in the office giving drug tests and sending guys on their way. The third thing I do is really emphasize faith in prison. There are an army of volunteers willing to come in, but believe it or not, the prison system makes it very difficult for them. Most of the prison executives are more worried about the time of their staff and bureaucratic things. Public safety is not their priority. What happens when the guys leave the gate? They don't care. It's what happens inside the prison. And that's very narrow thinking. Instead, broaden their view to where, in fact, we've advocated that wardens should be graded and promoted based on the recidivism rate of those in their prison. Now, they're not responsible for every single guy that goes bad, but you can tell a prison with a low recidivism rate versus one with a high recidivism rate, something different is going on there. There was a warden at Folsom that had 3,000 volunteers coming into Folsom. That takes a lot of work on the warden to recruit and train those volunteers, but what a gift to those inmates. There's some prisons where there's not one volunteer signed up. They make it so darn hard that people stop trying, and to a bureaucratic guard, it's more work to process a volunteer through the gate, so they do all they can to come up with an excuse. Meanwhile, they're denying the inmate access to people who care for him, who reach out to him and say, I'll help you. You got to keep your nose clean, but I'll help you. I'll walk with you. that makes a huge difference. So we need to make prisons more welcoming and hold wardens accountable for public safety after they leave, not just in prison.
Pat, for our last question, we call our podcast Next Round because of PRI's proximity to wine country and our love of discussing public policy while enjoying a glass of wine. So if you could recommend to our listeners a beer or wine or malt or otherwise beverage that you're enjoying over the summer months.
Well, I'd be glad to. There's old expression, in vino veritas. In wine, there is truth. And I really love Don Sebastiani of the famous Sebastiani family has gone into business with his son. It's called Sebastiani and Sons. And they make a number of remarkable wines, and they're a reasonable cost. They're very good. Don knows winemaking inside and out. And I particularly like the 2009 Smoking Loon is the name on the bottle, Sauvignon Blanc. I just it really tickles my taste buds, and I highly recommend. Give it a try.
Pat, I think I've had that before. It's delicious.
Oh, good. Yeah, I'll tell Don.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. It was a great interview.
Well, thank you, Alina and Tim. I really appreciate this opportunity.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.